Okay, everybody, welcome. Delegates to COP29. Thanks for being here. Hopefully my voice can project far enough that we can build this audience up. We will do our best to project from here. Speakers will be coming up to make interventions, but then we'll be having a bit more of a fireside chat, so you might need to huddle in at that moment.
Fireside chat.
I'd like to thank the Cryosphere Climate Initiative for the opportunity of using their pavilion and being able to connect and deepen that connection. This event today, which is hosted by the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, is entitled The Push for a Finance Transition Out of Fossil Fuels. Why we're banking on a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it's going to explore how public and private finance can be mobilized, but also reformed to support the transition away from fossil fuels and strengthen the just transition globally. So just a little bit of background on the Fossil Fuel Treaty. This is a bold idea for a legally binding treaty on ending fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. We get this question all the time, so I will say it now. There is not a treaty text yet. That will be negotiated soon by a critical mass of endorsing nation states. What does the treaty support look like, though, in the current context here at COP29? We're currently backed by 14 endorsing nation states, and I'll read these out quickly, but in the order chronologically in which they came. So Vanuatu, Tuvalu, Fiji, the Solomon Islands, Tonga, Niue, Timor-Leste, Antigua and Barbuda, Palau, Colombia being exceptionally important as a fossil fuel producer, Samoa, Nauru, the Republic of Marshall Islands, and the latest, the Federated States of Micronesia. These are the countries leading the charge for a fossil fuel treaty and the countries who our initiative represents as we push for further and deeper political engagement. I think what's important to note is that after this event, we may be running off quite quickly, but that's to go to a ministerial which will bring together the senior officials of all of those 14 countries, plus a series of observer countries who are on the cusp of endorsing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Beyond that, we're backed by 120 cities, just under 4,000 CSOs, civil society organizations, and close to 1 million global citizens. The treaty is built on three key pillars. Firstly, to stop fossil fuel expansion. Secondly, to wind down fossil fuel production. And thirdly, and very importantly for today's event, to ensure a just transition. But this requires financing, and that's why we're at the Finance COP on Finance Day with three finance specialists. So before I do hand over to them, and yeah, also with a short intervention from Cryosphere as well on the science, we're going to be unpacking today the challenges, but also, and super importantly, focusing on the solutions to transition. That's why we've got these three great speakers. I'll introduce the panel now, and then we'll pass over to Ella Wood. But I've got Avinash Prasad. He's a special advisor on climate change for the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, with a whopping 30 years of experience in finance, public policy, and academia. Avinash Prasad is also one of the architects of the Bridgetown Initiative and a special climate envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados. There's a whole host of other things that I might not have time to read off, but it's an exemplary LinkedIn profile. Further up next, Martin Rona, Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. Founded in 2009, GABV is a network of 70 sustainable banks operating across all major global regions, united by its mission to finance change and to change finance. I just want to say that we have a press release out today because 25 of those banks, so sustainable national banks, are now endorsees and active partners in the Fossil Fuel Treaty. We also have our very own, the eminent Dr. Amira Sawaz, who's a feminist researcher and advocate who works on the intersections of climate change, gender justice, public participation, and the social contract. Amira has 20 years experience working on these issues across academia, the private sector, think tanks, and NGOs. And finally, it's my real pleasure to introduce Ella Wood, who's joining us from the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, and is an early career researcher based between the University of St Andrews in Scotland and University of Bonn in Germany. and her PhD research is focused on quantifying ice storage in glaciers in Central Asia. I'm going to need a bit of a lesson on some of that, but that's exactly why I'm here, a foil to their expertise. So yeah, everything needs to be done in layman's terms, please. Before we get into the 3 bits on finance, I'd really like to welcome Ella to give us a little bit of the science and remind us why action is so necessary and so quickly.
Okay, thanks Tom for that introduction. Yes, my name is Ella and I'm here with the ICCI. So the cryosphere is all parts of the world that are frozen. So ice sheets, glaciers, sea ice, permafrost and snow. And already we're seeing changes across all aspects of the cryosphere. We see the melting of ice sheets driving sea level rise. We see the retreat of mountain glaciers and sea ice. And we see the increased emissions of carbon and methane as Arctic permafrost melts. And we know these changes are already happening, and some of these changes
looking at addressing some of the risks of foreign exchange.
There is a big blockage in capital from rich countries to poor countries. Let's manage and deal with, unblock that capital, supercharge a transition. And we need the multilateral development banks who can lend long-term, low cost, to lend 3 times more than they're lending, to focus on adaptation, to build up resilience. And we need new forms of revenues. I spent last month at the Marine Forum, the Global Marine Forum. We need levies on shipping, carbon taxes on shipping to generate revenues. We need fossil fuel taxes, like the US oil spill fund. We need financial transaction taxes, a range of taxes that will fund loss and damage through revenues and grants, not through loans. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks, Avinash, and setting out some of the challenges starkly, but as ever, focusing in on solutions. And bringing up now Martin Rona as well to do the same.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Well, first, let me say a few words about the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. We were created 15 years ago with this vision to put finance at the service of people and planet rather than profit. So just after the financial crisis, what we want to do, and I think Tom already alluded to this, we want to finance change, but we also want to change finance. We believe that banking has a dual role and that we need to be guided by the right values. Now, what does it mean to be a values-based bank? It means that you first and foremost look at what does the world need? What do the communities that you're serving actually need? How can you support them? And then you build a business model around that. I'd like to share an example of Triodos Bank, our founding member, which is based in the Netherlands. In 1986, when Chernobyl happened, Triodos Bank realized that nuclear energy probably is not going to be the future. We need an alternative type of energy, and they started financing as one of the very first banks, if not even the first bank in Europe, renewable energy. So this is almost 40 years ago. And I think that shows you something that I've been walking around and listening to some of the mainstream banks talking here at COP29, and they speak about renewable energy finance, green lending, climate change, as if they've just discovered it and are the leaders in this. And sometimes I wonder if they've really looked into what others have been doing for a very long time. This is where we come from. Now, let me give you a bit of a background on the nature of the problem. There's just been a report that has come out from the Banking on Climate Chaos Initiative, and they've shown that the 60 largest banks in the world have been providing $6.9 trillion US. These banks are slowly awakening to the challenge that they have. Last but not least, because investors and regulators are forcing them to change. They have reduced their funding from about 900 billion in 2022 to about 700 billion in 2023. I'm not sure this is a real trend. In fact, I wouldn't put it away that this is simply a reflection of the economic cycle that we're in right now, and that this number might be going up again. Now, why is the GABE and its member banks supporting the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty? We believe it's the right thing to do. It's as simple as that. So if you go and have a look at these 60 largest banks in the world, currently they don't have a policy on stopping the expansion of fossil fuels, let alone on phasing out fossil fuels. All of our member banks, or most of our member banks, inherently do not finance fossil fuels. and most of them have an explicit policy not to finance fossil fuels, and they're definitely supporting to stop expansion. So we simply believe it's the right thing. We also believe that banks and businesses more generally, they can weigh in on public opinion. They can weigh in on the opinions of governments. And in order for the treaty, for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty to happen, we need to have more governance on board in order to get this off the ground. And so what we're trying to do, we're trying to work with our governments where our member banks are active, so they understand the challenge, but they also understand that finance can actually make a difference and that banks can actually support this treaty going forward. So I think that's the message to you, and I'm happy to respond later on to any questions you might have.
Thanks, Martin. And yeah, Amir, if you'd like to take the lectern.
Okay, I'm going to do my best. Can you hear me? If it's louder, I don't think I can speak louder, but I'll do my best. Okay. All right. So where to begin off those brilliant presentations? Something that we think a lot about is the fact that about 80% of the global population lives in countries that are net importers of fossil fuels. So the issue of fossil fuel phase out is not only applicable to countries that produce fossil fuels, but the majority of countries in the world. About 6 billion people are dependent on fossil fuels from other countries, which makes them particularly vulnerable to shocks and stresses, particularly geopolitical shocks and stresses as well as climate ones. And then, of course, low and middle income countries are being locked in to fossil fuel production, which is why we at the moment have about 110% more planned fossil fuel production than is compatible with 1.5 degrees. This is fundamentally due to an unjust global economic system, to which Avinash was speaking to. And the COP's president's remarks that fossil fuels are a gift from God, while clearly a defensive position, it's sort of illustrative of the challenge, really. You know, we do need to start having a more frank and open conversation about fossil fuels and how we actually address the challenges and the barriers to phase out. But as long as we're still expanding production, we're growing the problem. We're not actually in a transition while we're still expanding production. So what we're trying to do as the Fossil Fuel Treaty is really start to have an honest and open conversation. We're learning about the barriers to transitioning off of fossil fuels, both for producer countries and consumer countries. And we're working with different stakeholders to explore ways to overcome those barriers, both through a treaty platform, which we believe in, but also in our big networks supporting their advocacy on the wider global issues and the movements around economic, trade, political, and climate injustices. So we've set in place a new research agenda, which is effectively supposed to provide evidence, building off of the evidence that's already out there from Avinash and others, which can help us to think through what a role a treaty could actually play in generating and channeling finance for the just transition, and also incentivizing new forms of international cooperation between states, particularly southern states who can build more solidarity with each other. But what we've learned from doing a big global mapping, which builds off of some of the work that's been mentioned already, that Avinash had 3 points which were absolutely critical, and we've looked at it in 3 buckets of challenges and barriers as well. So the first one, obviously, is debt. Almost 60% of developing countries are either in debt distress or they're at high risk of debt distress, and this has doubled in the last 10 years. So currently, at the moment, many countries are servicing debt payments in a way which is making it very hard for them to invest in their transition. And for others, they're dependent on fossil fuel revenues as well for those payments. The second cluster is innovative financing mechanisms and investment. The capital costs being the big issue and a huge barrier, which is why only about 2% of global investment into the renewable energy transition has actually gone to the continent of Africa, for example, because the capital cost is so high. And then the third one is, how do you actually start to vision how to replace fossil fuel revenues at scale and speed? So we're also thinking about this issue. You know, we need to make progress now. We can't wait. So we need to start having more large-scale creative thinking about new mechanisms and new forms of international cooperation to replace fossil fuels. And I think it's important to say there's not a lack of finance. So developing countries are currently asking for 1.3 trillion USD. But according to Oil Change International, they just released a report which said we could find 5 trillion USD with the right mechanisms being channeled rather. So this is what they're owed as well. So what we need to do is start funneling in some of those mechanisms. And what we're thinking about is what could a treaty platform offer? So the mapping of all those mechanisms is in one of the reports down there, which I can speak to a little bit more later. So how can a treaty help? The first thing it can do is include, set up appropriate functional instruments and mechanisms within it. And what it can also do as a block of member states working together is support and strengthen critical parallel processes. For example, the Bridgetown Initiative. And we found that there are 6 ways that a treaty can enable just transition finance. So it can raise funds from developed countries and corporates to transfer to developing countries. It can develop new mechanisms to disperse funds to developing countries. It can have or channel in processes or mechanisms to help countries diversify their economies or remove barriers to accessing finance. It can have processes, instruments, and mechanisms to facilitate mutually beneficial trade relationships that can unlock fairer financing for the transition. And finally, and not the least important, transparency arrangements. So what are the transparency arrangements that can be crowded into a treaty platform to ensure that there is some more accountability over finance flows from industrialized countries or China, for example, to other low and middle income countries? And a treaty can have hard obligations on states, but it can also have soft law obligations, and it can have enabling conditions on wider stakeholders. So, for example, treaties typically only bind nation states, but certain provisions can provide a mandate for others to act. So, for example, multilateral development banks. So if you look at Paris, Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement requires making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low GHG emissions and climate resilient development. And that has been read as a mandate by multilateral development banks to revisit their portfolios and then to ensure their funding practices align with the 1.5 degree critical temperature threshold. So we're talking about a number of mechanisms, and what we want to do is have conversations to really figure out which ones we should narrow into. And I'm happy to have a discussion in more detail about that later. Thank you.
Amira needs to go and speak at a ministerial in about 30 minutes, and I hope we haven't made her lose her voice. But
I'll just speak for the rest of the day.
So, in terms of some questions, Martin, maybe I'll start with you. You outlined some of the banks that you work with, and while there's a great endeavours and practices, one might question the scale and the size of the banks that are representing GABV. Do you see that as a challenge?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So depending on the market, we're operating, or our member banks are in over 40 countries around the world. Depending on where they are, they might be quite small. And in other markets, they might be systemic. They might be the largest or second largest bank in the market. So I think depending, of course, on the type of bank, they can have a different type of impact. And that's very specific to the context they're working in. So a large bank in Africa operating in the rural areas, for example, might be not just looking at climate mitigation, but also at climate adaptation, helping farmers adjust to and building resilience against drought and against floods, while at the same time promoting regenerative farming, which again is good for mitigation. And smaller banks might be maybe more focusing on funding affordable housing that's at the same time also very low energy input, and consider certain construction standards that are beneficial. So I think that's important to understand. At the same time, the way we see ourselves is we have actually some banks that have quite sophisticated business models, just like the big banks. And these can be actually projected. Very often you hear the big banks say, well, you know, these are smaller banks, we can't be compared, etc. We believe the larger you are, the greater is your responsibility in finance, because we believe that finance inherently is a values issue, it's a political issue, because you can decide where the money goes that your depositors, your savers are putting into the bank. You are the ones pushing it either in renewable energy or into the fossil fuel industry, for example. So you have a big responsibility, and you need to have the institutions and the governance to make sure the money goes where it needs to go. Another argument that you often hear is around data. I've been hearing this as I've been attending some of these events. We need more data, we need more data. I think the Riodo's example is a very beautiful case in point, where they just felt and knew this is the right way to go, this is the right direction to go, even though at that point no one in the public domain was talking about climate change. And I think that's why you sometimes have to really have those checks and balances. You need to reflect on what you are doing. Every business and every bank, especially, must legitimize its business by a social purpose, not simply by profit for its shareholders and for its managers.
Fantastic. And I mean, Avinash, maybe turning to you and hearing that from Martin. Obviously, a lot of great work coming from banks like the JBB network. Could you maybe expand a bit on how you see the balance between public and private finance in the transition?
Well, I think that public banks have a very big role to play. There are lots of things we need to do that's long term. Lots of things we need to do now. So we need to bring forward early. We need the cost of funding to be as low as possible. And so I see that many of the sort of pioneering parts of this transition needs to be led by the public banks. But they can't do it all. We want them to be 3 times bigger, but they're probably not going to be 12 times bigger. And I think that actually, if it all had to be done by the public sector, it would mean that we haven't really changed the nature, we hadn't really made a transformation to our economy. We hadn't transformed the way we do economic activity. And so we would need the private banks, especially those with good values, to be involved in that transition.
Yeah. I mean, speaking about transforming the economy, Amira, I mean, we've got a paper out on the transition in the Caribbean region, which explores debt for renewable swaps. Could you maybe say a little bit on that particular measure and mechanism?
Sure. I should say that the idea has been designed by experts from the region who are with us today. So in the Caribbean, there is a number of countries have a high debt burden and have been struggling to channel the finance towards different sort of renewable energy projects. And so the example that's used there is a debt swap. A debt swap is an idea that it did originally emerge from civil society, I believe. I think WWF came up with the idea originally, and they've been implemented. Is that wrong? I think that
It doesn't matter. It
yeah,
doesn't
it doesn't matter.
matter. Seychelles, 11 years ago,
Well, that was WWF, wasn't it?
a variety of people.
Right. But okay, so there have been a number of debt swaps, and what they do is they offer partial cancellation of debt in return for a specific, or an investment of that, what would have been a debt repayment to a particular project. Originally, a lot of them were around conservation. There's been different kinds of debt swaps now. There's been challenges to those debt swaps from civil society around how inclusive they are, how much debt they actually reduce, issues around which stakeholders have designed them, and so on and so forth. And those challenges have been laid out in that report. But as Avinash was saying, we do need to come up with solutions. We all believe in macroeconomic justice and moving towards a fairer global economy, but we also have to chart a path towards a fairer global economy by trying new things. And so the experts from the region have come up with a proposition for a debt for renewable swap in Dominica, where there is actually great potential for renewable energy, but there isn't necessarily as much access to the capital or fair access to capital for them to actually do it. So that's one example.
Great. And now I can do a shameless plug, which is if you are wanting to read any of the resources from Amira's amazing research and policy team, you can use the QR code in the top corner. There are a few on the table, or visit the website at fossilfueltreaty.org. There we go. For all our audience across YouTube as well. Martin, we've talked about this a bit and the theory of change that we have as, in terms of our cooperation between GABB and the treaty. And you touched on this a bit, but maybe you've got some other examples or something you want to illuminate about the role you think that your banks can play in supporting domestic action and government engagement at the domestic level.
Yeah, a very nice example that comes to mind is NMB Bank in Nepal. So NMB Bank is one of the larger banks in Nepal, and at the same time, they are a leader in the finance of renewable energy, whether this is hydro, whether this is wind power, or even solar in the country. And they're really helping push forward the transformation of the sector, of the energy sector. Now, what's great about being a large bank in a country like that is that you have some weight, you have some clout. So they are really engaging with their energy ministry. They're discussing with authorities around the frameworks, the financing framework, as well as the policy frameworks. Because at the end of the day, it's not just, I think you probably would agree with this, if we want to save the climate, it's a multi-stakeholder exercise. We need everyone on board. And I think the banks being kind of at the hub of the economy, of the private sector, of the public sector, of individual people on the street, they can play a huge role in bringing them all together and sensitizing people and managing that stakeholder process moving forward.
Fantastic. Of course, yeah, please intervene, yeah.
I think we know one of the interesting things to be aware of is the complex geography of the transformation we want. When we think about poor countries, rich countries, we often have a picture in our mind of some of the most vulnerable communities. And they tend to be in places that actually are not big emitters of greenhouse gases. And so their priority in their minds is actually about adaptation and loss and damage. And we definitely need to support them in doing that. There's another bunch of countries, the large and middle income emerging markets, the Brazils and Indias and Mexicos and Indonesias. These are countries that are middle income. They're not eligible for concessional funding for the big development bank focused on some of the poorest countries. And yet that's where we need that transformation to be most rapid and most urgent, because they're about to have an explosion of increased energy demand. And if that explosion happens in fossil fuels, then the planet is literally cooked. We need we need the new energy coming on. And the first thing we need to do is that new energy should all be renewable energies. And then we can tackle the hard transformation of existing production, because that's often tied up with social costs, because we have to transform not only the existing energy production, but the whole economic system, the towns and communities that are so much attached to that. But let's manage the new energy demand in some of these middle-income countries. If we don't do that, then we've lost the planet.
Strong challenge there from you, Avinash, and maybe I'm pass over to you with this, Amira. I mean, one of the calls there as well in around the just transition, that this needs to be global.
Yeah.
And this is definitely one of the calls of the treaty. Can you maybe say a few more words on that?
Well, we have to do that without creating more debt, which I know you work on a lot. And we also have to do it in a way that countries are able to build more power amongst themselves and to try to undo this kind of global dynamic which has maintained itself since colonial times, right? One of the things that, there are a number of different mechanisms that we're interested in the treaty, but one of the ones that countries that seem to be very interested in are these, what they're calling like a producer consumer club, like a trade club of countries that are producing fossil fuels and want to transition off them, and then consumer countries that also want to transition off, and creating these mutually beneficial trade relationships where they can trade down the fossil fuels they'll have a reliable source of revenue coming in and they can then invest in the transition. This is obviously not the same thing as unilateral trade measures, which are highly criticized in this space, but it's more about incentivizing states to work together on a clear plan for fossil fuel phase out. So this could involve things like the group of countries agreed to accelerate the phase down of fossil fuel consumption, whilst also imposing sort of club mandated border measures on fossil fuels from other producer countries, and then refunding the proceeds of these measures or parts of them to producer members of the club who've agreed to accelerate the phase down of production and with commensurate support. So the reason why we're interested in these sorts of ways to try and replace fossil fuel revenues is we totally agree, like we need to stop production of fossil fuels and invest in the renewable transition. But if I speak about, I mean, I worked in Pakistan for a very long time. Pakistan has recently taken on over $1 billion USD worth of debt in order to accelerate solar. And of course, that's very important, but the terms in which that debt have been negotiated have actually created great risks for a country that's already economically massively at risk at the moment. So what we need to start thinking about is measures which build more economic and like cross-country political power. And that's why we have this kind of treaty platform. Very high ambition, big vision, but we think that it can make a difference in the long term.
Great. And speaking on high ambition and maybe less ambitious outcomes, Avinash, could you maybe give us a flavour of where things are at in the negotiations so far? We're hearing a lot on blended and layered finance. Maybe say some of the potential outcomes and risks.
I think we're still in a fairly delicate, fragile state where most negotiating groups are still in a position of laying out their positions as opposed to laying out compromises from their positions. But we'll see what happens over the next few days. I think there's been a very interesting transformation, though. You know, one of the challenges of the $100 billion and this NCQG, awful acronym, is basically the new 100 billion. So the problem with the 100 billion is that when they became a little bit closer in hitting it, it also became obvious it was an irrelevant number. We were fighting and squabbling over a figure that was not going to do anything to the transformation. And so they've evolved to this idea that there may be two numbers, a very clear, explicit number about what is needed. And that is a big number. That's the 1.3 trillion needed for cross-border, not needed in total, needed to transfer from rich to poor countries, 1.3 trillion. It's important that we recognize that number, that we have that number there somewhere. But we also know that what the high power money to get us there, the multiple sources of money will get us there. We will need multiple sources of money, but we will need a core set of high powered money, of grants, concessional finance that very much lead the thrust towards that number. And there's going to be a debate about what that number is. And that hasn't been decided yet. I think that if we don't see a tripling of the figure from 100 to 300 in terms of the core number, then we haven't really had a deal that helps us move forward.
Yeah, please, Amira, go.
I think we can all agree a lot of this is also about finance prioritization. So the $100 billion goal, you know, recently somebody did analysis which found that if 5% of global military expenditure had been diverted to that, it would have been 110 billion a year. And military expenditure has grown every year for 9 years, and it's at its highest level. So there is something about the prioritization of finance, and we need to start having more public conversations about that as well, because a lot of it's being left to civil society who are seen as kind of the radicals, right? But actually, this is an issue that's relevant for every person across society. We need to start connecting more with people on those.
Yeah, now another avenue for me to do a plug, which is a paper we just put together with one of our key feminist partners, the Women's International Liberation and Peace Group, which is on stopping fossil fuels fueling conflict, looking at how fossil fuels have been a key catalyst in ongoing historical conflicts. And you can also find that on the resources of our website. Just backpedaling slightly and looking at what we were just discussing in sort of the negotiations and what we might consider as front runners. We always need somebody to be the high ambition pushers. And Martin, I think it's safe to say some of the banks in your network are definitely that. we want to scale up. And what do you see the role of GABV in being able to push larger financial institutions to change their portfolios?
Yeah, I think we are the innovators. We're the ones that go ahead and show the examples and the cases, which then the large banks can adopt. So that's one way of how we work with the large banks. We engage with them and we want them to really join us. I think the most important message that we want to tell to those banks is, if you adapt your business model, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to be less financially resilient or less profitable. You're just going to be in it for the longer term. You're going to be more stable in the longer term. You're not going to have that volatility that you typically see. And we can actually prove that with the numbers and research that we've been doing over the period of 10 years. The other way how we're trying to influence the large banks is by engaging at different levels in international projects. So some of our member banks have been instrumental in helping coin the principles for responsible banking. We've been also instrumental in expanding the partnership for carbon accounting financials to the point that it has become the de facto standard for greenhouse gas accounting across the world in the financial industry. So these are initiatives through which we indirectly also influence the mainstream banks. Maybe just coming back to what we heard about the 100 billion being mobilized. You know, it's all good and well, and let's hope we get at least 100 billion, maybe even a little bit more. But at the end, what also matters is the quality, how this money is going to be applied. And unfortunately, the devil is sometimes really in the details. So what we have experienced, I just came back from the Africa Regional Chapter meeting, and our African member banks are the kind of banks that are not simply sitting in the capital of the African countries and financing the big commercial companies, but they're the ones that are serving the rural areas, that are serving adaptation out there. And they don't need the big money. They need maybe, order of magnitude 10 to 20 million US dollars from the DFIs. Fact is that when you talk to an IFC or to an African Development Bank, they won't touch you if you're not at least 50 million to 100 million US dollar transaction, for the simple reason that public money comes along with a lot of strings, with a lot of detailed accountability, a lot of reporting. I understand that, but it simply doesn't work with the small banks. It only works with the large banks. So the money actually goes where it's not most needed. So I do hope that when we're talking about these 100 billion, we're not just talking about the amounts, but also about the quality and how this money is going to be deployed.
Great. One last question from my side, and then I'll open up to the audience. We know that COP29 isn't the be-all and end-all, otherwise we wouldn't have got to 29. So looking ahead to 2025, and hopefully some pot marked with some optimism, maybe you could each say something that you're optimistic for in the world of finance in 2025. Avinash, I'll start with you.
Well, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and the Convention lays out a system. We have a system. We have a system of nationally determined contributions. And next year, and the NCQG is about how we facilitate ambitious NDCs by providing some finance to get us there. And so next year, we have to start focusing on greater ambition on the NDCs. We know that these nationally determined contributions, even if they were hit, would still not get us to 2 degrees. So we need more ambition, and that's why we need to get a good NCPG settled here in order to get good NDCs LM next year.
Amira, need a moment to think?
Sorry, you were saying what are we hopeful about?
Yeah, something for 2025 to leave the audience with. It could be in your own research agenda or something on just transition.
Oh. Actually, no. To be very honest with you, I mean, I'm sitting in on the negotiations here. It is hard to feel hope about the actual political will. So I'm hopeful about high ambition countries coming together, whether that's through a treaty initiative or through BOGA or through other international cooperation initiatives. I'm hopeful about that. but perhaps I'm feeling a bit down today because of the state of where the negotiations are.
We'll have you elevated by week 2, I assure you. Yeah.
We will.
Martin, do you have some?
Yeah, look, I'm in touch with 70 banks across the world. So I hear what's going on in different parts of the world. And what I find extremely encouraging is that maybe with a few exceptions in North America, I see a lot of momentum around more generally sustainability and specifically around climate finance. What do I mean by that? It's actually regulators, governments adopting policy measures that are forcing the banks to move in the right direction. So I think, like Ariash said before, the system is slowly gaining momentum, and it's, you can't get out of that anymore. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of that happening and how it's going to play out in the next couple of years.
Great, thanks. I'm open for some questions, and yeah, please.
Hi, I'm David Hillman from Stamp Out Poverty. We're a UK treaty partner. And we've worked on loss and damage. So I just want to answer Amira's point, because when we were at COP a couple of years ago, loss and damage wasn't even on the agenda when we started, and we ended up with a fund. So I think we should at least go into the next week with a glass half full kind of hope and see what we get out of it. But the question I wanted to ask, and perhaps Avinash, you might be able to answer this, is that at the beginning of next week is the G20. And I wondered what your thoughts were about where the G20 might be with supercharging the energy transition.
It's a great point, because I think, and it connects a bit with what Amira was saying, as a former negotiator, we have a view as to what should be done by the other side, but the other side are governments, and they have been elected, and they have mandates, and they are not being elected on a mandate to send huge amounts of finance to other countries. I kind of quip that they're being elected to deport foreigners, not to fund them. So that's who you're dealing with. So we need civil society to be playing an active role in those countries to kind of change some of that discussion. But ultimately, it's a political discussion. The technical negotiators do not have the capacity to set a price and to make that politics. Where that can happen is in Brazil next week with the G20. So we need to make sure you're lobbying your ministers and your countries when they go to G20. The G20 began this Brazilian G20 with ambition, but they haven't really delivered. So they've got a final opportunity maybe to raise their ambition, and that can help and have a big impact back here at COP just before we end.
Follow up on that. I actually have something I'm hopeful about. It's come to me. No, I'm hopeful about many things, but I don't know if any of you have been in the negotiations. The one that I'm tracking was suspended earlier, but it will be fine. So on the G20 platform, there is, for example, an idea around a wealth tax, a 2% tax on billionaires. Now, whether that comes through or not, hopefully there'll be some progress towards that idea. But more importantly, like publics in these richer countries actually really support these ideas. I come from a background of doing research with publics in the UK, in the US, and other big economies. And publics do really support these ideas around taxes and levies. And I know there's the climate damages tax that David's also led on. So I do feel hopeful about some of those mechanisms and ideas. We just need to socialize them more and bring more people.
Great. We've got time for one more question. Yeah, please.
There are low-income countries that you can incentivize to transition, and there are also countries with a robust civil society that can inspire policies. But there are some relatively high-income countries that don't have civil societies or influential countries like Qatar, Russia, maybe Azerbaijan, that are going to be very hard to influence to transition, particularly the treaty agreements. So how can we reach countries that don't have robust civil societies and aren't very acceptable to the Caribbean?
Okay. I think there's a notion that I think what you're referring to more is the control of civil society. Of course, there is a robust civil society in all of those countries, but they are dealing with certain constraints, right? What part of the reason why we like the idea of a treaty is a bunch of high ambition countries coming together and finding ways that they can cooperate and create incentives, and that will also have disincentives for others. So over time, for example, with these trade clubs, might be one way that eventually those who are consuming fossil fuels from some of those countries that you mentioned may be making deals with other new bilateral or regional deals, and that will be reducing their kind of relationships with wider countries. So maybe we won't have every country in a treaty, but maybe we'll have a larger group of high ambition states that are willing to sit together. There's different ways that you can do treaties. You can have a UN treaty where most UN member states join, like the UNFCCC, or you can have a smaller, high ambition treaty approach, which has worked effectively with some of the previous treaties.
Can I just say one thing which combines a little bit of those points and David's earlier. One thing that is happening at G20 next week is the final endorsement of the ministerial statement, and within it is a facility to try and turbocharge the transition in some of these countries by dealing with the foreign exchange risk, to bring capital from rich countries where it's abundant to poor countries and unblock that flow by unblocking the foreign exchange risk. And the development banks are making a commitment to be offering foreign exchange when it is most needed in times of crisis. If that happens, I think it will encourage a greater flow and accelerate that transition.
Great. On that note, and also because we're rushing off for Lisa, Amir and I to a ministerial with our 14 endorsing countries plus a number of observer governments, we're going to close there. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to everyone watching on YouTube. Thank you to the Cryosphere Initiative for hosting us. And most of all, thank you to our three speakers and also Ella Woods at Science Intervention. Round of applause, please. Again, for anyone interested, there are all our resources on the website, and you can scan it with your QR code as well. Thank you very much.
For development,